In the middle of the 20th century, a 14-day conflict would erupt after Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. This conflict would forever change Western relations with the Middle East and lead to the decline of the once powerful British Empire.
In January of 1956, Nasser was elected as president of Egypt and a new constitution was created. Nasser's road to presidency began when he was a young officer in the army. During his service, Nasser formed a revolutionary group called the Free Ones. This organization would lead a bloodless coup d'etat and establish Nasser as the leader of the new government. As the president, Nasser successfully signed a contract with Czechoslovakia, which would provide him with Soviet weapons. Nasser also convinced the US and Britain to give $260 million to finance the Aswan High Dam, which would provide hydroelectric power to a majority of Egyptians. On July 20th, Nasser's success would come to an end when US Secretary of State John Dulles withdrew aid for the Aswan High Dam because of Nasser's growing connections with the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China.
As President Nasser of Egypt tells a wildly cheering crowd in Alexandria that Egypt has seized the internationally owned Suez Canal. His announcement touches off a rapid series of reprisals and counter-reprisals. Britain freezes all Egyptian funds, and Egypt retaliates with the same measures.
The nationalization of the Suez Canal caught the attention of both Britain and France. The Suez Canal was built in 1896 by Frenchman Ferdinand de Lesseps and stretched for about 100 miles from Port Said to the Gulf of Suez, which was operated by the Suez Canal Company, whose largest shareholder was the British. The canal was to remain neutral in times of both war and peace, and free passage was also established. The Suez Canal was vital to Europe because 2/3 of the oil used came through the canal. Nasser's actions angered British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, who believed the nationalization of the Suez Canal would hurt British economy and prestige. Here's a statement about British Prime Minister Anthony Eden from Sir Guy Millard Fifield.
And Eden felt, I think, a sense of betrayal there. Also, of course, when the canal crisis broke, the nationalization of the canal, he felt that this was a threat to his own political position because he had been Foreign Secretary when the Suez Canal base was evacuated, that agreement with the Egyptians, whereby we removed our troops from the Suez Canal zone, and therefore diminished our capacity to react to any threat coming from the Egyptians or coming from the Middle East. And I think that he felt that, to a certain extent, his own position was compromised by the nationalization of the canal.
Britain then initiated Operation Musketeer, which was a coordinated attack with France and Israel, with the goal of retaking the Suez Canal.
Britain prepares for the worst in the Suez crisis. Part of her mothball fleet, idle since World War II, is hastily made ready for action. President Nasser continues to defy the Western powers on his seizure of the canal and seeks the support of Russia and the Arab League countries.
Egypt and Israel were constantly in conflict due to border disputes and the rivalry between the two countries. Israel saw an opportunity in the Suez crisis to reopen the Straits of Tiran and to strengthen its borders against Egyptian aggression. On October 29th at 5 o'clock, Israel deployed paratroopers in the Mitla Pass. This action was not an offense, but a strategy for France and Britain to enter the war. More Israeli troops entered the Sinai Desert on October 30th under Israeli General Moshe Dayan and advanced towards the Suez Canal. The British and French began their attacks on October 31st with a bombing campaign. Here is one Israeli soldier's account of the invasion.
Our mission was to disrupt Egyptian forces heading to eastern Sinai to fight Israeli troops crossing the Sinai by land. We were located at a position about 60 kilometers east of the canal and were ordered to hold on until a full brigade of paratroopers crossing by land rendezvoused with us.
Nasser retaliated by sinking 40 ships in the canal, which would block off the canal for many months to come. Nasser also pulled troops from the Sinai Desert to defend the canal against the Anglo-French invasion. The British continued with their aerial attacks and destroyed most of the Egyptian planes, allowing them to place troops on the ground. By this time, the UN had already conducted an emergency meeting where a ceasefire was proposed. Britain and France vetoed this proposal and defended that they were only policing. Despite pressures from the US and Canada, Britain and France continued their operations in Egypt.
Efforts toward a ceasefire continue at the United Nations. U.S. Ambassador Arthur Goldberg introduces the peace plan, and immediate debate is started in the Security Council representing 15 nations. While the United States and Russia disagree on the wording of the resolution over troop withdrawal, Israel's Foreign Minister Abba Eban charges UAR President Nasser plotted the murder of a state. The vote is finally taken and the resolution adopted unanimously. Word continues to come from the battle zone, telling of sweeping Israeli victories. Next day, Egypt accepts the UN ceasefire, joining Jordan. This left Syria facing Israeli forces alone.
On November 5th, 668 British paratroopers and 470 French paratroopers landed on Port Said and began to occupy the canal. Their success was short-lived as international pressure for a ceasefire grew. The US was increasingly concerned about the war and threatened economic sanctions to all of the aggressor nations if they continue. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev also threatened to use nuclear missile on Europe if the attacks persisted. These threats led to economic panic in Britain, and on November 7th, Britain and France agreed to a UN ceasefire. The UN also deployed the United Nations Emergency Force to Egypt on November 21st.
By December of 1956, the British and French withdrew all their troops from Egypt. The British Empire was greatly weakened by the endeavors in Egypt, and many consequences would arise. Oil shortages would hit Britain and last until May of 1957. Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned in January of 1957 due to public pressure and health issues, along with many other British officials. This humiliation toppled Britain's superpower status, and they lost their influence in the Middle East to the Soviet Union. Israel also withdrew all their troops from Egypt by March of 1957 due to US pressure.
I think that the American attitude was had much more weight. I think it was the pressure on the pound, and the American refusal to allow us to exercise our drawing rights.
At the end of the war, Egypt was given ownership of the Suez Canal, and they began to clear it of ships and mines. The canal reopened in April of 1957 after Egypt paid 6 installments of about $81 million to shareholders of the Suez Canal Company. When the canal reopened, the UN tried to allow free passage, but Israel was prevented from using the canal. Although Israel could not use the canal, it regained shipping rights for the Strait of Tiran. President Nasser gained popularity by the end of the war and was viewed as a hero for Arab nationalism. Nasser would eventually fund rebel groups that sought independence from Britain.
Nationalism is rampant during the demonstration, and the raising of an Egyptian flag is a signal for general rejoicing.
The compromises after the Suez Crisis effectively changed relations with the Middle East and Europe. By intervening on behalf of the Egyptians, the Soviet Union gained influence in the Middle East, while British and French influence continued to decline. Nasser would continue to rise in power and would become a symbol of nationalism in the Middle East.